Alejandro's family was as ordinary as they come, and there was nothing wrong with that. Their lives revolved around simplicity. His father worked as a storekeeper at the local factory, bringing home a decent, though not extravagant, paycheck. His mother was a housewife who occasionally did some sewing work from home to earn extra money. The family had enough to live comfortably and provide their two children with what they needed. Little Fina was in the third grade of elementary school. She was a very active and playful girl with cunning gray eyes. She loved going to art exhibitions and helping her mother cut out patterns for clothes, but more than anything, she adored her older brother, Sandro. Sandro was a middle school student, soon to move up to high school. Compared to his sister, he was more composed, but it wouldn't be fair to call him boring. He was simply older. Sandro enjoyed spending his free time playing video games, but with his extracurricular activities and CrossFit training, he didn't spend too much time in front of the computer. In fact, gaming was a way for him to communicate freely with others. His classmates seemed too immature to him, and other peers annoyed him with their irresponsibility and obsession with trends. However, he was unaware of the communication challenges he would face in the future. One day, his parents suddenly announced that they were moving. They had been considering for some time that two children of different genders shouldn't share a room, so they decided to buy a new apartment. Of course, they still had to take out a mortgage, but they had already built up a certain financial cushion. The new neighborhood was much better. There were no dilapidated buildings, number 24-hour pubs, and no other signs of a troubled area. The new housing development was more suitable for comfortable family living, and logically, the local school was better as well. Alejandro wasn't too upset about the move, but Fina was a different story. She had many friends at her old school. "Mommy, what about Tia? How can I leave them with Carla? They're constantly fighting without me," the girl cried. "I like this school, I don't want another one." Her parents tried sincerely to support her, explaining that in the new class, she would have the opportunity to make new friends. Moreover, the magnificent playground right outside their apartment building would likely introduce her to a new circle of acquaintances, where children of different ages played every day. Sandro, on the other hand, liked the new school. The kids here weren't clingy, no one forced him to make friends or join a group, and he was left to his own devices, which he definitely appreciated. His studies went smoothly, and at one point, he thought the material was too easy. However, the teachers assured him that his feeling was because he was a very capable student. At the end of the first semester, his parents were offered the opportunity to transfer him to a specialized class. Naturally, no one refused the chance to provide Sandro with a better education. "Son, this is such a blessing. You're just amazing, being one of the best in such a good school," his mother said with undisguised pride on the day the principal called. But from that moment on, things began to go wrong. You could only get into the specialized class through good grades or through well-off parents, and in this case, the latter prevailed. The wealthy kids immediately sized him up, scrutinizing his every move, drawing conclusions that only they understood. Sandro stood out among the others, noticeable for his modesty, with his old model phone and simple clothes. In their eyes, he was just a regular nerd who couldn't stand up for himself. And with that, Alejandro's tough days began, filled with the bullying he could do nothing about but endure. Of course, he spoke to his parents about what was happening. It was impossible to hide the shabby clothes or torn textbooks, but Sandro tried to downplay it. "Mom, it's nothing," he said, trying to reassure his concerned mother. "Teenagers are stupid. I know this school is good, and I won't have another chance to get such a diploma." "Son, we can transfer you to a school in the neighboring district," she insisted, pressing a crumpled kitchen towel to her chest, trying to shake off the anxiety. "No diploma is worth more than your health. Maybe we can go to the principal and discuss the situation." His father, who had been sitting quietly in the chair next to the open window, put his cigarette on the edge of the ashtray, frowned, coughed into his fist, and said sternly, "All right, go to the principal and tell him about the bad kids who are bullying your son." He paused meaningfully, "And have you thought about how they'll treat Sandro after that? Like a mommy's boy, a snitch, a wimp?" Teenagers only get tougher when adults interfere. Let him handle it himself like a real man. He's already decided to stay, so no need for Mom to hover around. Sandro looked at his father with mixed emotions. On one hand, he wanted to thank him for supporting his decision, but on the other, his father's opinion about teenagers seemed pessimistic, even hurtful. Could they all really be so mean? Alejandro lowered his head. Of course, he felt terribly uncomfortable in the new class, but did his father have to express it so harshly? And you'd better give them a good answer. You only need to show the pack of jackals your teeth once, and they'll scatter, his father added sharply, reaching for his cigarette again. But won't that just provoke them more? If I resist, they might get even worse, Sandro muttered, rubbing his shoulder where a fresh bruise throbbed. It's hopeless, can't struggle, can't endure, can't even call the adults. What can we do? Maybe give one of them a good smack in the face too, his father suggested. Enough of that, his wife interrupted. Kids today are made of a different fabric. Force won't work against them. Sooner or later, they'll even report us to the police. Their parents are rich, it's easy for them to make our boy look guilty. I'm telling you, let's transfer him to another school, and that's the end of it. And I'm telling you, the boy has the right to decide which school he wants to attend, a good one or an ordinary one, and our son has made his choice. If he doesn't know how to solve his problems, then let him endure until he's had enough. He'll come to some conclusions and put on a show for all of them. A mother's heart ached at the thought of someone harming her child, and she was relentless. After a moment of silence, she continued to press her husband. Then where are the teachers? What are they doing? You answered your own question. Their parents have a lot of money, so their kids can do anything. These brats have a field day while the children of ordinary workers get the short end of the stick. The teachers don't care what happens to a simple boy. This argument led to hours of quarreling. The parents rarely argued, so Sandro felt doubly guilty, not liking being the cause of their dispute. The boy sighed heavily and retreated to his room, where he could still hear fragments of the bickering adults' phrases. They both talked about how Alejandro couldn't handle things on his own, but he didn't argue with that. By asking to stay at this school, he understood perfectly well that the bullying would continue, that they wouldn't have enough money to deal with these kids. He knew he was leaving himself in a dead end. The quality of education stood higher in his priorities than his pride, and this approach distinguished him from his peers. His online gaming friends supported him in every possible way, and that was enough for Alejandro. He knew he wasn't alone and that there were people who cared about him, even if they weren't his family. As for school, things went on as usual. As soon as Sandro entered the classroom, all attention was on him. The boy barely had time to sit down before the first bullies approached him. "Hey, nerd," a girl with provocative makeup spat out. "Will you let me copy the homework?" Without waiting for an answer, she grabbed Sandro's notebook and tried to pull it towards her. But when Sandro sharply snatched it from her hands and put it back in place, the bully's face changed. "Did you not understand me?" "That wasn't a question, you idiot," she snarled, grabbing the notebook by the edge and trying to drag it away again. "Sit still and don't move unless you want your bones to stay intact." Alejandro, distracted from his phone, lifted his head and, with a determined look in his eyes, slammed his hand down on the notebook. The sound of the impact made the surrounding students jump, freezing in anticipation of a show. Waiting for Lucia to say something, Sandro spoke first. "Look, your lackeys are breaking my bones, Daddy covers for you with the police, and you get satisfaction while staying happy. And then what? What's in it for me? Bones will heal, bruises will fade, and we'll pay the medical bills. So what's the point? You've been pushing for who knows what for half a year already. What's your end game?" For a moment, Lucia was stunned. Sandro had never tried to oppose anyone before. Realizing quickly that her authority among her classmates was diminishing with every passing second, the girl began to improvise. "There's no endgame," she laughed in Sandro's face. "You're just so pathetic that you're begging for a beating. Look at your stupid face, loser. You don't belong here at all, and it's our duty to constantly remind you of that." The lackeys laughed along with their ringleader and dispersed to their seats. Alejandro surveyed the room with a gaze full of anger and disappointment. Apparently, they really enjoyed their impunity. His father was right, he needed to at least try to defend himself. Maybe then he could find some relief and pull his pride out of the mud they had trampled it into. Meanwhile, little Fina quickly made friends in her new class. They often gathered in the schoolyard and spent time together. Overall, all the girl's worries were unfounded. She had indeed found new friends. But one thing saddened her childish heart. During breaks, she often saw her older brother being bullied. Sandro strictly forbade his sister from approaching him during such times. He didn't want these hyenas to target his sister too. And Serafina didn't want him to be sad. However, her desire to support her brother in everything prevented her from obeying his prohibitions, and she often watched with sad eyes. One day, Mom tasked Fina with delivering Sandro's lunch, which he had forgotten on the table in the morning. Feeling the little responsibility, the girl ran to his class with a skip in her step, her shiny, curly, dark chocolate-colored hair fluttering in the wind from her brisk pace. She burst into the open classroom door and stopped on the threshold, scanning the room with her eyes to find her brother. Fina spotted his desk but couldn't see him anywhere. "Hey, are you lost or something?" Lucia asked unusually kindly. "Maybe I can escort you to the right class?" "No, I'm looking for my little brother. Mom said to give him his lunch. Did he step out somewhere?" The teenagers exchanged glances, their faces lighting up with predatory smiles as they swiftly closed in on the girl, surrounding her. "Oh, so you're Sandro's sister?" Alejandro returned to the classroom, unaware that his sister had been sent to him. The closer he got to the door, the stronger an unsettling feeling grew in his chest, a sense of foreboding. He had become so accustomed to the atmosphere in the classroom that he had grown used to this feeling, but this time something was definitely off. Entering the classroom, he saw a disgusting sight. His sister was wailing at the top of her lungs, with lettuce leaves and chicken pieces stuck in her thick hair. Next to her, Julio stood giggling uncontrollably, holding an empty paper food bag. Sandro's fists involuntarily clenched at the sight. "Sandro," the little girl pleaded tearfully, "Sandro, tell them to stop." "Big brother." But Sandro remained silent. Out of anger, he clenched his jaw so tightly that his tense jaw muscles were visible to the naked eye. He ignored everyone except Julio, staring directly into his mocking eyes. Instead of a loud confrontation, he approached Julio and put a hand on his shoulder. "Let's talk," he said, the steel in his voice causing the taunters to momentarily lose their smiles. Julio, eyeing Sandro, involuntarily snickered. The thing was, Alejandro had always been this gentle giant, a tall, well-built guy who never engaged in open confrontation. But now, such an offer to talk no longer sounded pitiful or funny, it was serious. Yet there was no backing down. Julio's reputation in the class was at stake. Behind the two boys, the other participants in the bullying slowly crept closer. "Brother, where are you going?" "Don't leave," Fina cried out, but Sandro reassured her, "Wait for me here." "Don't worry." He handed her some wet wipes from his bag. The girl nodded silently. In such moments, she trusted her brother more than anyone else. There had been similar situations in their old school, and she knew perfectly well how it could end. Just as she knew she didn't want to watch it. The procession went out into the courtyard. Teachers, seeing the heated crowd of teenagers passing by, immediately rushed to the principal's office, sensing trouble. But nobody followed them. Many of the teachers just watched from the windows. The teaching staff consisted mostly of women who wouldn't be able to do anything or might even get hurt themselves. Once Sandro and Julio were a bit away from the crowd, Sandro roughly grabbed Julio by the collar and pushed him away so that he stood a couple of steps opposite him. This action was immediately accompanied by cheerful laughter, and Julio, carefully hiding his fears, feigned a smirk. Alejandro watched him from under his brows, maintaining his iron silence. "So, what are you going to do, nerd? Burn a hole in me with your malicious stare?" Julio smirked, though his voice trembled. Maybe you want to find out? Julio let out a haughty laugh, taking just 2 steps towards Alejandro, his final 2 steps. It all happened very quickly, with only a dull thud and the rustle of clothes. It was a precise, well-placed blow landing squarely on Julio's jaw, and that was enough. Julio clumsily collapsed to the ground, executing a strange pirouette beforehand. What? Lucia squealed in utter disbelief, a sentiment shared by all present. The teenagers exchanged bewildered looks. None of them had even considered that the school introvert could pull off something like this. Domingo emerged from the crowd, cautiously eyeing the victor. It seemed like he was heading towards his friend, but Sandro wasn't concerned. He shifted his weight onto his legs and forcefully pushed Domingo with his chest, sending him flying. Adrenaline still pulsed through his veins, and Alejandro was ready to continue if needed. But the bystanders understood the situation and had no desire to approach him. Sandro approached them himself, and the crowd immediately parted, allowing him to make his way back to the school. However, instead of doing so, he positioned himself so that everyone could hear and see him. "Do whatever you want with me," he said, his voice unusually loud and deep. "But lay a hand on my sister, and I'll break every one of your faces, and no amount of money will fix them. Clear?" Alejandro glanced at his fist. The skin was slightly peeled on the knuckles, with small droplets of blood welling at the edges. After all, nobody knew that before he got into CrossFit back in elementary school, he used to box, even winning top places in his age group. But nobody asked. To them, Sandro was just a big, quiet guy. Now all his classmates would know their boundaries. The director, a middle-aged man with a touch of gray at his temples, was already rushing to the scene. "What is this supposed to mean? What are you doing here?" he demanded, pushing through the crowd. Upon reaching the center of the circle, he immediately saw 2 boys lying on the ground and Sandro with an injured hand a little away from them. "You! Where are you going? You're the top student." "My sister is in the 5th classroom, where someone spilled food from her lunchbox all over her. She's in hysterics, and now her clothes are all dirty," Sandro growled angrily. "So while everyone's doing whatever they're doing, I'm going to her." Somewhere in the background, Julio began to moan in pain, gradually coming to his senses. Meanwhile, Alejandro ignored the director's angry remarks and walked past him. As he had mentioned earlier, he needed to get back to his little sister. He planned to deal with all the consequences the next day. For today, his schooling was over. After retrieving his sister from the classroom, he escorted her to the foyer and then went to her classroom, where he gathered her belongings and briefly explained the situation to her teacher. The principal intercepted him at the entrance. Instead of a disciplinary conversation in his office, Sandro suggested they talk while they walked with his sister to the school gates. Despite his apparent dissatisfaction, the man agreed, seeing Serena's condition. As a father of 2 daughters himself, he felt sympathy toward her. He couldn't imagine what he would do in his student's place. On the way out of the school grounds, he also learned about the prolonged bullying Sandro had endured, which came as a real revelation to him. Apparently, the teachers didn't want to raise any extra fuss, which led to such incidents. However, recalling Alejandro's classmates' parents, he himself didn't want to stir up trouble. The boy's motives were clear to him. He warned Sandro that he would have to call his parents, to which the boy silently nodded. That's where they parted ways. At home, his parents were already waiting for him. While his mother was extremely displeased with the news, his father proudly smiled. "Here he is, my man, came home as a winner," he said. "Look, Fina, you should hang out with boys like him. No trouble is scary with such a lad around." "Shut it, old donkey," his wife snapped at him, swinging a towel. "Our son got into a fight, and you're sitting there rejoicing. Weren't you the one convincing me not to touch those rich kids? And now what?" The father grinned mischievously, a smirk on his face that only appeared when he felt like an absolute winner. He chuckled, settled comfortably into his chair, and began to explain. While you were running around the kitchen like a headless chicken, right after the director called, the scoundrel's father called me. A decent man, I must say." He chuckled again, earning another hit from the kitchen towel. "They won't do anything to our Sandro. The gentleman won't press any charges, said our boy acted in good conscience. He even praised him for such a precise punch. They'll only ask us to cover Julio's hospital bill. Seems our boy went a bit overboard with his strength, so the idiot will be wearing a bandage for the next 2 weeks. You hear that, son? You dislocated his jaw." The father burst into mocking laughter so hearty that he didn't even pay attention to his wife's hits and complaints. Once she calmed down a bit, the woman turned to their son. She gave him a stern look and stood up, hands on her hips. "We'll pay from your pocket money, all right, son?" "Fine," the boy muttered indifferently, then went to his room. For several days at school, everything was quiet. The teenagers were still discussing the incident in the yard, while Julio, with a bandage on his head, silently drilled his enemy with his gaze. It was total humiliation. What he had asked for, a provocation, could hardly even be called a fight. Moreover, as a result, he not only lost but ended up in the hospital. Julio nursed a grudge against Sandro. Meanwhile, Sandro quietly began to enjoy the calm atmosphere in class. 3 days later, Serafina disappeared. Sandro and Serafina often finished their lessons at different times, but the school was literally around the corner from home, so no one thought that anything could happen to the girl in just 5 minutes. One day, she simply didn't return from class. Her phone was unreachable, and no one saw what happened. The parents immediately reported their daughter missing. Alejandro was shattered. He looked even gloomier, and his skin took on a gray hue. Besides his gaming friends, he had no one to share his grief with. His mother was struck by the tragedy. His father began to disappear frequently, coming home with a strong smell of alcohol. At home, Sandro couldn't find solace. He also had to comfort his mother and help her around the house. The woman could no longer sew clothes. Every time she touched the patterns, she remembered how her little girl sat next to her and helped. Money in the family was dwindling. The father drank, becoming violent, constantly discontented, and even aggressive. He started skipping work, not even bothering to cover up his absences. The police reassured the family, promising they would return their daughter any moment, but it never happened, not after a week, not after a month. Serafina simply vanished. At school, Sandro's classmates quickly noticed the changes in him. His clothes looked even cheaper, and sometimes he came dressed inappropriately for the weather. But what interested the teenagers more was the total indifference with which the once popular guy began to treat all the teasing. "Hey, nerd, scared for your fate?" Lucia asked him one day. "Decided to stop teasing, huh? It's the right thing to do. You just got lucky with Julio's father." Sandro gave her an empty look, then lowered his head again, staring at the desk. This scenario definitely didn't please the girl. She snorted, then forcefully pointed her finger at the boy's forehead, forcing him to raise his head and look at her. "Are you completely out of your mind? I'm talking to you. Don't you dare ignore me. Can I ask you for something?" Lucia raised her right eyebrow in surprise. A request from him to her? It sounded intriguing, and finally, the boy reacted. The girl crossed her elegant arms over her chest as if showing by her appearance that she was granting him the right to speak. "Disappear." Lucia burst into laughter. Her reaction was immediately echoed by everyone watching and listening to their conversation. Among them was Julio, whose headband had long been removed. The guy stood up from his seat and, with a slow, languid gait, began to move towards Sandro's desk. "Buddy, looks like you've gained some courage," he began amidst arrogant laughter. "Our last conversation didn't end nicely, but I think you need a refresher on how to communicate with your classmates. What do you think? Maybe it's time for a rematch?" Sandro smoothly shifted his gaze to Julio. He sighed heavily. "So your dad can send us another hospital bill afterward?" "No thanks." Julio's eyes narrowed, his face reddening slightly as stifled laughter rippled among the classmates. He noticed a slender guy sitting in the front row, watching the interaction with undisguised interest, though he seemed reluctant to laugh at Julio. "Hey, you," Julio called out. "Could you step outside for a moment?" The boy grinned when Julio addressed him, already having an idea of what was about to happen. He immediately got up and briskly walked towards the exit. Sandro, as expected, remained calm. He had no interest in his classmates' antics. All his thoughts were directed towards little Fina. The bitterness of loss outweighed the feeling of trampled pride. "And now, my friends, the show begins," Julio announced loudly, jumping onto a neighboring desk. "Your faithful servant will now demonstrate the wonders of dark training, right? Sandro, you're a humble mutt from the poor neighborhoods, needing to learn proper behavior in civilized society." Anger slowly boiled in Alejandro's chest, but he had no strength to resist. He just wanted nobody to notice his existence, to leave him alone, to ignore him, to boycott him, anything as long as he could be left alone with his thoughts. But Julio persisted. He jumped off the desk and forcefully snatched Sandro's backpack from the back of his chair. Sandro didn't bother reaching out to grab the strap. He knew they would return it eventually. He was used to this. "And the first command for today is fetch." Sandro suddenly looked up, and the last thing he noticed was his backpack flying out of the open classroom window. He got up, the chair crashing aside, and everyone present immediately burst into laughter. Julio had already assumed a defensive stance, ready this time to receive Sandro's blows. Then, from the open window, Chu's voice rang out. "Hey, Julio, look here." Julio glanced briefly in Sandro's direction, who hadn't taken any action yet, and approached the window. There, Chu was waving one of the flyers that spilled out of Alejandro's open backpack during its flight. In the classroom, there was a grave silence. Sandro sat in his seat again, this time glowering at one of the flyers. The text read, "Have you seen this girl?" with Serafina's photograph printed in the middle. Below was a description of her appearance and the last day she was seen in the area. No one felt like joking anymore. Everyone held these flyers, remembering the day they decided to tease Fina. "You, how are you?" Julio asked, his voice tinged with guilt. "Why didn't you speak up?" Sandro bitterly smirked. He pulled his sweater sleeve over his wrist and wiped his moist eyes. "It seems we're far from being friends enough to share such things with each other." "That's true, but we're still human, right?" "Are we?" "I haven't noticed anything human in you over these past 6 months." Teenagers cringed at this remark and averted their eyes. "You bullied me, and then you went after my sister, all because my parents aren't businessmen. Does that set me apart from being human? Or perhaps you think you're acting humanely. Listen, buddy, I'm not your buddy, okay? It's pointless. If your conscience has awakened, it's better to just leave me alone." And his request was granted. The next day, no one approached him. Some even started greeting him, but Julio and Lucia, as the most incorrigible troublemakers, feared crossing paths with him again. Sandro sighed with relief. The day passed without fuss, but when he returned home, a real surprise awaited him. In the living room, there were about 10 adults, with several more in the kitchen. Sandro had seen them all before. At school, they were the parents of some of his classmates. Bags of groceries stood in the corridor. It was unclear why anyone would need so much food. Among these bags were also bags of clothes. The boy watched the whole procession, unable to understand what was happening. "Son, here you are," his mother said affectionately, clearly having cried for a long time before he arrived. "These gentlemen found out about Fina. They came to help us." "So you went around showing my son's face?" one of the men asked menacingly, then, contrary to everything, laughed. "Now that's a fighter. My boy needed a good shake-up for a long time. I have to give you credit, after spending 2 weeks with a muzzle, he did become calmer. Sorry for the hospital bill, but I couldn't just let my rascal be right, so it's fair he gets a dislocation and a reason to think about his behavior next time." while you get minor sanctions and a reason to try avoiding a fight next time. My daughter brought home one of the flyers from school. They told us that after school, you quietly plastered them around the city. It's amazing how not a single one of them ever caught our eye, added the woman sympathetically, who looked like his classmate Adela as 2 drops of water. You had to go through so much because of our children. Assistance with searches, with money, all of it is the least we can do to atone for their guilt. After these words, Alejandro's mother became emotional again and covered her face with her hand. Sandro looked around but didn't see his father anywhere. Staring at his father's now empty chair, he was about to ask his question, but his mother preempted him. The treatment at the clinic was paid for by your father. He needs it now. The woman approached her son and gently pressed him to her chest. Don't hold it against him, son. Everyone copes with grief as best they can. People waited for the cupcakes that Alejandro's mother hastily decided to bake. There weren't enough cups for everyone, and with awkward laughter, the woman had to ask their neighbors for some. After sorting out the family's life, which was going through a tragedy, sympathetic businessmen began to disperse, praising the hostess for her hospitality. They all promised to leverage their connections to expedite the search for the missing Serafina. Just 5 days later, her fate became known. A woman named Marcela Castillo had lost her daughter in a terrible accident several years ago. Little Tio was a late, long-awaited child. Marcela's husband died shortly after their daughter's funeral. His heart couldn't bear such a blow. And Senora Castillo's psyche couldn't cope with such grief. For many years, she concealed her sorrow from everyone, which resulted in the development of severe mental disorders. Therefore, when she saw a girl on the street who remarkably resembled her deceased daughter, she couldn't distinguish reality from her illusions. She took little Fina, lured her into her car by deception, and took her to her modest home outside the city limits. This incident was so absurd that it was hard to believe it existed. The woman didn't let Fina out of the house, took away her phone, and monitored her every move, fearing that her daughter would disappear again. Throughout this time, Serafina was completely safe. Doctors didn't detect any problems other than stress-induced psychosis. The woman was forcibly sent for treatment. The family was reunited. 2 more weeks passed. Father was discharged from the clinic, unable to hold back tears of joy and sincere gratitude to those who helped bring back his little girl. A year later, Sandro finally made friends with his classmates. Now they were studying in high school and often hung out together. They realized that a family's wealth does not determine a person's identity. Julio even asked Sandro to teach him how to throw a proper punch. Little Fina recovered from the effects of the severe stress and became the cheerful and active girl she was before. 5 years later, the family received an unexpected letter. In it, Marcela earnestly asked for forgiveness for that insane incident but also thanked them. The forced treatment helped her overcome her sorrow, and now she could call herself a healthy person. In her letter, she shared all the horrors she had to endure, describing the treatment process. Line by line, the letter descended into repeated apologies, and even so, through the paper, it was clear that this woman was no longer the Marcela Castillo whose madness led her to steal someone else's child. In describing the results of therapy, she added that the treatment allowed her to dare to enter into a new romance. At the clinic, she met a widower with whom she went through rehabilitation together from start to finish. Dear viewers, if you enjoyed the story, please support the video by liking it and leaving a comment. Thank you very much.